Welcome, curious minds, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey back to the formative years of the United States. We're specifically exploring how and why American foreign policy really began to take shape and expand. We've been sifting through some insightful excerpts from America's early global and hemispheric ascent and, some other valuable sources too. Think of this deep dive as your essential guide, really, to understanding a pivotal period, a time when a young nation, still finding its footing, started to assert itself, maybe with unprecedented ambition, on the world stage.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is to try and uncover the specific events, the policies, and the strategic decisions that propelled the U.S., from struggling just to establish an independent global presence to actively claiming territory, aggressively promoting its trade interests, and perhaps most crucially, establishing this sphere of influence and control over the Western Hemisphere. It's quite a shift.
It really is.
We'll be looking at a complex mix, military actions, some shrewd diplomatic efforts, and even some, controversial internal policies like American Indian removal, all of which contributed to this remarkable ascent.
Indeed. And you'll hear about everything from its very first overseas military engagement, which was, frankly, an audacious move for a new republic, to bold territorial acquisitions that literally redrew the continental map, and of course, a landmark declaration that fundamentally reshaped its relationship with Europe. These aren't just, historical footnotes. They're really the bedrock upon which America's global posture was built.
Yeah.
So how did these early gambits set the stage for everything that followed? Let's dive in and unpack this together.
Okay, so when we look at the origins of American foreign policy, our sources consistently highlight that trade wasn't just a factor. It was the massive engine for development, absolutely crucial for establishing the U.S. as, a credible global presence. But gaining a foothold in international commerce, especially for a young nation, that was far from straightforward, wasn't it? What were some of those early obstacles they faced? Oh, it was an incredibly challenging environment, yeah. The early U.S. found itself navigating a world dominated by these established European maritime powers, and its merchant ships were, frankly, often targets. This really forced the young nation's hand on the international stage. It compelled it to define its sovereignty not just on land, but crucially on the high seas.
Right.
What's particularly revealing, I think, is how these early conflicts, they didn't just defend American commercial interests. They also significantly defined American resolve and its willingness to act independently.
And this brings us straight to a really defining moment, doesn't it? The Barbary Wars. These weren't just singular events, but actually two distinct conflicts, right? From 1801 to 1805, and then again in 1815. For years, the U.S., like many European nations actually, had been paying tribute, paying off the North African states, the notorious Barbary pirates who were systematically attacking American shipping in the Mediterranean, seizing vessels, enslaving crews.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about money or, protecting a few isolated ships. This was a fundamental challenge to the very principle of free trade and, frankly, national honor. President Thomas Jefferson, who was famously wary of foreign entanglements, he took the incredibly bold and, for the time, pretty unprecedented step of refusing to continue the tribute payments.
Wow.
He dispatched the nascent U.S. Navy and Marines to the Mediterranean to confront the pirates directly. This act marked the very first overseas military engagement for the United States, a truly definitive moment in its young history.
And what a statement it made. It really boosted America's global presence. Because before this, U.S. merchant ships often had to rely on, British naval protection, didn't they?
That's right.
So by taking on the Barbary states, America signaled it would defend its own interests abroad. As our sources describe it, it was kind of a declaration of independence, not just from European political control, but from their maritime protection as well. Establishing the U.S. as a nation willing to project force to defend its trading rights. That was a huge step for a young republic, often dismissed or overshadowed by the established European powers.
Absolutely. And connecting this to the broader geopolitical landscape, the U.S. also struggled immensely to navigate the complex and often hostile environment of the ongoing European wars between Britain and France. One attempt to safeguard its commerce was this thing called Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810.
Ah, yes.
This legislation was a desperate, maybe even a high-stakes gamble trying to play Britain and France against each other. It sought to reopen trade with both, with a promise, essentially, to cut off trade with whichever nation didn't lift its restrictions on American shipping. But as we know, Napoleon, always the opportunist,
He manipulated it.
he shrewdly manipulated it, yes.
So instead of securing American trade, this maneuver kind of showed the U.S. was still vulnerable, right? struggling to protect its neutral trading rights. And it actually contributed significantly to the rising tensions that helped spark the War of 1812. It was a stark demonstration of how deeply America's economic interests were entangled with and often jeopardized by these European conflicts.
Precisely. And the War of 1812 itself, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, it was ignited by a confluence of factors. The deeply resented British impressment of American sailors.
Right, forcibly taking them.
Forcibly conscripting them into the Royal Navy,
Yeah.
Ongoing restrictions on U.S. trade, British support for Native American resistance on the frontier. The U.S. basically found itself fighting to defend its national honor, protect its maritime commerce, and, maybe to a limited extent, assert ambitions to expand into Canada.
Though the territorial gains from the war were relatively limited, weren't they? Aside from sort of confirming the border.
Yeah.
But the psychological impact was immense. Major battles, like that decisive American victory at New Orleans fought even after the peace treaty was signed famously, that massively boosted U.S. nationalism. This conflict really helped solidify a shared American identity and establish the U.S. as a nation, not only willing but capable of standing up to major European powers to defend its sovereignty.
So, after all this conflict, what did this mean for the future trajectory of American trade? Where did things go from there?
Well, by the late 1820s, despite these early struggles and the conflicts, Americans had successfully established pretty thriving trade relationships, and these stretched far beyond just European entanglements. New England manufacturers, for instance, found eager new markets down in Mexico for their textiles and goods, a real southward shift in focus. Interesting. And it wasn't just hemispheric, right? American merchant ships, those intrepid vessels, were carrying goods across the Pacific, establishing robust and pretty lucrative trade in Chinese porcelains, silks, tea. This really underscores the expansive vision of these early American traders and entrepreneurs looking far beyond the Atlantic.
Yeah, absolutely. And this burgeoning global trade, particularly with Asia, had significant domestic implications, too. It definitely sparked ambitions for acquiring key Pacific islands like Hawaii and Samoa, though those aspirations wouldn't actually materialize for decades.
Right, much later.
But more immediately, and perhaps more profoundly, this increased demand for U.S. goods and the need to transport them efficiently. It spurred a revolution in manufacturing and infrastructure that we now call the market revolution.
The market revolution.
Exactly. This was a fundamental transformation, shifting the American economy from, local, often agrarian self-sufficiency towards a more interconnected, factory-driven system. It really laid the groundwork for industrial power decades later, powered by new canals, roads, steamboats, linking different regions together.
So, with its global trading presence firmly taking root and expanding rapidly, the U.S. then turned its gaze inward, more specifically to its own continent. This period saw significant efforts by the U.S. government to gain vast swaths of territory, and also to settle these lingering border disputes, particularly with Great Britain and Spain. It seems like, having asserted itself globally, it was time to consolidate at home.
That's a crucial point, and it does raise an important question, doesn't it? How did a nation so intent on defending its own borders and sovereignty against European powers then turn around and push its own borders outwards so aggressively? It reveals a complex and maybe sometimes contradictory set of priorities, often driven by this powerful ideology of westward expansion.
Okay, so after the War of 1812, the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, it left many territorial issues kind of unclear, didn't it? Especially regarding that vast, often unmarked border with British North America or Canada.
Right. Very ambiguous in places.
But in 1817, President James Monroe sent the incredibly capable John Quincy Adams to London. This diplomatic effort led first to the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which demilitarized the Great Lakes. Huge step. And then the Convention of 1818, which famously established the border between the U.S. and Canada right along the 49th parallel. A clear line across the continent, from the Lake of the Woods all the way to the Rocky Mountains.
And what's particularly shrewd about that 1818 agreement is that it also established a joint U.S.-British occupation of the disputed Oregon Territory for the next 10 years.
The joint occupation.
Yeah, this wasn't a surrender by either side. It was actually a clever diplomatic compromise. It temporarily avoided potential conflict over a highly sought-after region, and it allowed both nations to explore and use the area while basically postponing a final decision. It bought time and prevented an immediate flashpoint.
Smart. But the acquisition of Florida, as our sources highlight, this is where the story gets really interesting and maybe a bit more controversial. Spain's control over its Florida territory was weakening dramatically. largely because of those ongoing rebellions in its South American colonies, demanding its limited attention and resources.
Right, they were stretched thin.
This created a highly unstable situation on the U.S. southern border. You had Seminole Indians, communities of runaway enslaved people, various white settlers living in Florida, frequently crossing the border, raiding U.S. territory, causing constant border friction and a sense of insecurity in the South.
So in 1817, President Monroe dispatched General Andrew Jackson, fresh off his victory at New Orleans, remember, down to Florida. His orders were strict, though, protect the American border from these incursions, but explicitly not to engage directly with Spanish forces. It was meant to be a delicate mission, respecting Spain's sovereignty over the territory, needed a light touch.
Jackson, however, well, he famously exceeded his orders, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
He didn't just chase raiders. He aggressively attacked two Spanish forts, St. Mark's and Pensacola. And in a move that truly stunned international observers, he controversially executed two Seminole chiefs and two British citizens who he accused of inciting the border conflicts. I mean, this was a bold, incredibly risky move that could easily have sparked wider international conflict with both Britain and Spain.
Absolutely. And this aggressive action, although it initially enraged both Britain and Spain and led to calls within the U.S. government for Jackson's reprimand, it ultimately pressured Spain. Spain could plainly see the writing on the wall. The U.S. was clearly determined to acquire Florida. And given its own weakening grip and those ongoing colonial struggles, fighting a costly and likely losing battle to keep it just wasn't viable.
So they decided to sell.
They decided pragmatically to sell the territory to the U.S. rather than lose it by force.
And this was finalized with the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. A truly pivotal agreement, because it didn't just transfer Florida, right? It formally defined the border between U.S. territory and Spanish holdings way out west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, solidifying America's southern and western frontiers in a major way.
So what does this aggressive expansion mean for understanding the sort of unfolding American vision at the time?
Well, it demonstrated a pretty clear pattern. The U.S. was willing to use a combination of military pressure and aggressive diplomatic tactics to gain territory and expand its influence, even when those actions maybe bent or broke international norms and military mandates. And crucially, this period also deeply reflected a broader and frankly devastating policy of American Indian removal and the suppression of indigenous resistance in the Southeast.
Right.
The Seminole Wars.
Exactly. The Seminole Wars fought intermittently from around 1816 to 1819, and then again much more intensely from 1835 to 1842. These were brutal campaigns where the U.S. military actively sought to dislodge the Seminole people, many of whom had provided refuge to runaway enslaved people, by the way.
Yeah.
Dislodge them from their ancestral lands. So this expansion, it wasn't just an empty land grab. It was a forceful assertion of control over existing populations and resources, driving a really foundational aspect of American identity and territorial ambition.
So with these successes in territorial acquisition firmly under its belt, the U.S. felt emboldened, it seems, to take an even larger, more audacious step, seeking to explicitly limit European influence in the broader Western Hemisphere entirely. This was a significant strategic shift, wasn't it? Moving beyond just securing its own borders to asserting a kind of regional dominance.
It really was, yeah. By 1822, this wave of independence movements had swept across South America. Several nations, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Argentina, had successfully achieved independence from their European colonial powers. And President Monroe, acting pretty swiftly, officially recognized their independence and established diplomatic relations. Now, this was a clear signal of U.S. support for these new republics and a direct challenge to the old European colonial order.
And this leads us straight to that landmark policy enacted in 1823, articulated by President Monroe, something that would shape foreign policy for generations. The Monroe Doctrine. It just seems like a declaration of immense audacity for a nation still relatively young, right? Without the naval power to unilaterally enforce such a sweeping claim, what was it fundamentally trying to achieve?
Fundamentally, the doctrine served as a bold warning to the European powers, a clear hands-off message. It declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits for any future colonization or intervention. It asserted emphatically that the lands and nations in the Americas were, quote, in America's backyard, and thus, largely, their business. The core tenets were pretty clear. No new European colonies, no European interference with existing independent nations. And in return, the U.S. promised it wouldn't interfere in European internal affairs or with existing colonies. Essentially, the U.S. was claiming this vast sphere of influence, signaling its intent to manage affairs in its hemisphere.
That's a powerful assertion. But like you alluded to, given the U.S.'s relatively limited military and naval strength at the time, particularly compared to formidable powers like Great Britain.
Hmm.
How realistic was this doctrine in its immediate impact? How was it actually enforced?
That's a critical point. You're right. In its immediate aftermath, the Monroe Doctrine was probably more a statement of aspiration than an enforceable dictate. The U.S. simply lacked the naval power to unilaterally confront a major European power like Britain, France, or Spain if they chose to disregard it. Interestingly, it was actually British diplomatic and naval power, specifically through Foreign Secretary George Canning, who had initially proposed a joint declaration. That provided an indirect kind of bulwark against European intervention.
Oh, interesting. So Britain helped enforce it in a way.
Well, the British, for their own commercial reasons, also favored the independence of the new Latin American states. They wanted to trade with them. So while the doctrine sounded like this unilateral American declaration, its initial effectiveness relied pretty significantly on Britain's overlapping interests and their powerful navy.
Okay, so it was less about immediate U.S. military enforcement and more about a strategic political maneuver. That leveraged existing European dynamics while planting a flag, so to speak, for future American dominance. What does this all mean, then, for the U.S. and its evolving place in the world going forward from this moment?
Well, it officially challenged the long-standing European claim to authority in the Americas, and it symbolically asserted American dominance in its own region. It was a truly bold declaration that fundamentally shifted the dynamic of power in the region, at least symbolically, signaling America's coming of age as a significant, albeit still primarily regional power. It wasn't just about territory anymore, it was about projecting a vision of leadership and control. That would really lay the groundwork for future U.S. interventions and its enduring perception as the hegemon of the Americas for centuries to come. It truly set the stage.
Wow. What an incredible deep dive into the foundations of American foreign policy. I mean, from bravely defending its nascent trade against pirates and powerful European nations, to strategically acquiring vast territories through this mix of diplomacy and audacious military assertion, and finally, issuing that bold declaration that effectively redrew the map of influence in the Americas. It's just so clear these early actions profoundly shaped the U.S. and its eventual role on the global stage.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it, to see how these seemingly disparate events, a naval skirmish in North Africa, a land dispute with Canada, an aggressive maneuver in Florida, a diplomatic declaration about an entire hemisphere, how they all weave together to form this coherent, powerful narrative of a nation defining itself. You can vividly trace the foundations being laid for America's future global role, a role characterized by both assertive action and the strong, unwavering sense of its own sphere of influence and perhaps exceptionalism.
Exactly. So for you, our curious listener, considering the incredibly assertive and, let's face it, often controversial actions taken in this early period, from defying pirates and European powers to the forceful acquisition of Florida and that audacious declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, what are the lasting echoes of this foundational foreign policy approach in America's global posture today? How might that backyard mentality continue to shape perceptions and actions, both domestically and internationally, in our ever-evolving geopolitical landscape?
Something profoundly worth pondering, for sure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring.